That was Submission, directed by Theo Van Gogh, and screenplay by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan, I think the first question I'd like to ask is, tell us about Theo. What kind of a man was he? He was murdered 10 years ago. We know, or some, oh, you know, I forgot to do that. That's part of my bit usually. I usually show you my phone, and I say, if you have anything like this, turn it off. And I forgot to bring my phone with me. It's in the room. Should I go get it? Because you really need that prop. You see, I show you the phone, then you turn it off. No? So tell us, you know, we know about your own childhood growing up in Somalia, and you've written about your experiences under Islam. Theo Van Gogh was not Muslim. He was not a follower of Islam. We know that he said some very controversially provocative things about Islam, including the words goat fuckers at some point. But can you tell us about him, what you remember about, he was your friend and collaborator, and truly an artist who lost his life. And what was his motivation for making the movie?
First of all, let me say, you know, how incredibly humbled I am to be here, and I appreciate your greeting tonight, your reception, and I appreciate sharing the stage with a man I admire very much. And then Theo Van Gogh was someone in Dutch society who took pleasure in provoking debate and discussion, and sometimes engaging in provocation for the sake of provocation. With this particular film, that's exactly what he was not doing. He wasn't doing this to provoke the Muslim community in Holland for the sake of provocation. He was using his art and his stature. Theo Van Gogh, I think you could say easily, was probably the most well-known man, the most famous man in the Netherlands, and he's still so. In this particular project, he really wanted to provoke first the Muslim community, but more importantly, the liberal community in the Netherlands, to say, wait a second, we are dealing with women who are beaten by their husbands, and they're justifying their actions in the name of their religion. Women who are being raped, women who are being killed, and we liberals were going around saying, you know, diversity, inclusion, multiculturalism, but what are we doing about this? In this film, you can see he's clearly the artist. Everything you see there, the sound effects, the images, the way he has, you know, some of the characters quivering, the flogging, the lash of that's all Theo. All he asked me to do was just provide the text. And, you know, going back and forth, I didn't know him for a long time, but from the short time that I knew him, I knew he had a very, very serious side. And he tried to, the Netherlands is a wealthy country. It's a peaceful country. It's a country that welcomed its immigrants. I came as an immigrant, and I have only good stories to tell about how I was welcomed by the first individuals in Holland, and they became lifelong friends who are still friends. And I understand and understood that Theo was the kind of voice within that context who, I don't know, I can't think of an American equivalent. Maybe America is simply too large to have one individual assume the role of provocateur.
You mean like a shock artist?
He was a shock artist, and he almost had no competition in that. He could still shock people. He had shocked members of the Jewish community, members of the Catholic community. He had shocked feminists. Sometimes the person who comes to mind is Sacha Baron Cohen. Yeah. But think of Sacha Baron Cohen on a daily basis, unrelenting. But this he understood, and he was asking a very serious question. And that's the man I remember, and I remember his courage. I remember him. I said, you know, Theo, we're taking a huge risk here. I had protection very much similar to what we are seeing tonight, because the threats against me had started at least 2 years before that. It started in 2002. And I said, you don't have that kind of protection, so please don't put your name on the credits. And he said, I am going to put my name. It's my film. I made it.
Now, is that because he thought, because he's not Muslim, he wasn't in the same threat that you experience? In a moment, I'm going to talk to Brett, who covers the world, the world of Salman Rushdie, the world of Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Yeah.
Did he think he was going to be treated like you and Rushdie, or did he think he would be treated like the Danish cartoonists themselves, who were not Muslims, but also were exposed to fatwa? Did he think that he was safe?
And when we're making this, the Danish cartoons hadn't happened yet.
Hadn't happened.
They hadn't happened. That was end of 2005, beginning of 2006. This is 2004. But there had been a number of incidents. He had been threatened. He had been intimidated. He knew this. And he was a very smart man. He understood, for instance, when I said I didn't want to have any of the actresses, for me it was a condition I wasn't going to do it if the actresses would have their names on the screen. And
would they have allowed it? I mean, you would think they would not want to be known.
Well, the interesting thing is 4 of the actresses were Muslim, and they insisted that they wanted to have this done, and they wanted to be acknowledged for that. And I just said, no, we can't do that. And during your introduction, you talked about the red carpet. And if there are individuals who deserve the red carpet and who deserve the kind of recognition that brings with it, it's these women. But they're completely anonymous, and they will remain anonymous for a long time to come, because they have to choose between life and death. For them, it is not glamorous red carpet recognition, it's life and death. But they did it consciously. They wanted to be the ones to do that. And Theo van Gogh was protective of them, so he wouldn't have their names on. But about himself, I mean, it's a kind of chivalry that is very unique. And sadly, in the discussion right after the film was made, it wasn't about what the film was supposed to do. It wasn't about, okay, let's now talk about these events in the midst of a modern, in some ways postmodern liberal society. People felt, especially liberals, felt far more comfortable talking about his career as a provocateur.
Huh. So we were in Holland 10 years ago, the film comes out. What did Muslims object to, the Dutch Muslim community that must have obviously been very vocal in their anger? Were they more upset with Theo's visual imagery of veiled breasts, the Quran written on the backs and skin of women? Or were they angry at you for actually supplying the dialogue and the language of these? You do realize we were really hearing the story of 3 women or 4? It's 3 stories, right?
No, it's 4 stories.
It's 4 stories. So there are 4 individual discrete stories of violence.
Yeah, and it's almost like a prophecy, because we're now seeing some of these things carried out in public by ISIS, but perhaps what's becoming more open is what Sharia theocracies like Iran and Saudi Arabia have been doing for years.
So those were you invented 4 tales.
Yeah, and I tried to use fiction, but if you look at the text I made, you will see that there's a lot of Quran in there.
Yes. And is that the offense, that the Quran is written on the skin of women?
So this is, I think, what is going to shock this public, which is that 3rd generation Dutch Muslims who bothered to protest at all were far more worried about the fact that the Quran, the text of the Quran, was defiled. And it was defiled in this way. You have a sacred text which is holy and above anything that, in their view, humans can come up with. And it's written on a surface, the skin of women, unclean, suspect. And that's blasphemy.
The writing of the words of the Quran on the unclean skin of women.
Yeah, so if the Quran is here and women are here, and you take the Quran and you write that on the skin of women, and when Theo and I were discussing, what kind of backlash or repercussions could you have, I said, I grew up in and within Islamic culture. I know exactly how the Quran is valued, and I know this is going to be the reaction, but that's what's going to help us. This 10-minute film is going to help me and members of the liberal Dutch society to ask our fellow Muslim citizens, okay, what do you care more about in the 20th and 21st century? Is it how sacred this text is, or is it the fact that what the text says, which is beat, rape, flog, cover, and the unintended consequences, for instance, coming from the veiling, is that what we want to question? Do we want to protect fellow human beings, fellow citizens? We weren't even talking about, it wasn't geopolitics at that point, it was very local. Or do we, your new Muslim citizens, do you want to still continue and say, no, as far as we are concerned, the Quran is far more valuable as a text than human life? And we haven't had that discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now 10 years after that day, and I get a greeting like you've given me, and I just can't tell you what a huge difference that makes.
We want to be able to give that to you, so thank you, you deserve that.
Well, yeah.
So
Yeah.
are you saying,
So, okay.
are you saying that
Thank you so
liberal-
much. Thank you so much. It's not that I want you to applaud me. Thank you for doing it. I'm flattered. But it's what I want to say is that means now that Western society is open
Right.
to ask those incredibly sensitive and painful questions to fellow American Muslim citizens, fellow Dutch Muslim citizens. And that, in my view, is a breakthrough. That's progress.
So what we were just talking about a moment ago, this is very important to be clear.
Yeah.
Liberal Dutch society, you were saying
Not very different from liberal New York society.
what would be deemed the same.
Yeah.
You're saying that 10 years ago, this audience in Amsterdam, forget it, wouldn't have happened, forget the applause, but this audience constituted not as Muslims, but just liberal Dutch society said, we will choose the value of the sacredness of this religious doctrine, which isn't even ours.
No, they didn't say that. I wish they did that. It would have been clear.
Right.
No, they didn't say that. They said they just wouldn't even go near the subject. So you would have, I lived and served in a society that gave me all these freedoms and gave me, I could only become me and shape my own destiny because of the Netherlands and everything that the Dutch people gave me. Mm-hmm. And now I'm saying, okay, at that point we're worried about how to assimilate Muslim immigrants into Dutch society. And I'm saying, the way to do it, there are all these different factors, but let's emancipate these women. And here's how to, let's stop beating them, raping them, flogging them, killing them. Good. They agree with that. But then how do we start the discussion? There's this block of people that we want to have a conversation with. And I thought, we could use cultural tools, which is something that the Netherlands is great at, to have this conversation. And we were not having, in the Netherlands and in other parts of Europe, and I think to a certain degree in the United States, we were not opening this conversation about values and conflicting values using cultural tools that are by definition nonviolent. These cultural discussions were being triggered by violence. So if there's an honor killing in the Netherlands, then we have a discussion about the fate of Muslims amongst ourselves. And if you look at what happened in the last 10 years, that hasn't changed. You want to have a discussion about the problem with Islam? It'll be about protestations regarding cartoons, a film that is made somewhere. Nobody would ever have known what it was about, ISIS, you name it. But it's an act of violence that then has everyone galvanized to come to the stage and start asking the questions that we are trying to ask through these non-violent means. And that's what I blame liberals for. We have, in a liberal society, developed tools that are non-violent, that are provocative, that are cultural, that over the years have been tested. We've applied them to the Mormons. We've applied them to Orthodox Jews. We've applied them to radical Christians. We've applied them to communists. We've applied them to the post-Nazi period in Western society. And it's just absolutely maddening and frustrating to say we're just not going to apply them to Muslims. So unfortunately and paradoxically, every single discussion you have about what is the problem within Islam and how can we change that is triggered by such atrocities as beheadings and genocides and massacres committed in the name of Islam. And that makes me so sad and so angry, and sometimes I feel so powerless. And so when I say I appreciate your applause, what I take away from that is that you are applauding. Let's go down the path of provoking this discussion, which is urgent and necessary, through art and other nonviolent means.
Brett, I'm sure you have lots to say, because that was what she had just said was so rich and interesting.
Thank you, sir.
You know, you won a Pulitzer Prize for covering the global view, so the world is your beat. And although you were a young man, you're aware that how much of the global view beat has had to deal with these issues of Islam feeling offended and taking to the streets 40,000 people. It seems very easy to do in Muslim societies to get 40,000 people out. I remember Tom Friedman once wrote a column saying it takes nothing to get 40,000 people out on the street to say death to cartoonists, death to British novelists, death to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, death to the Pope, death to Israel. But when it comes to what about the Islamic societies, can we save Muslims, no one wants to come out and cheer that. Or protest that. And so just culturally, in terms of art, I mean, there is something astonishing about this phenomenon. I mean, Yale University has the academic press. They did a scholarly book about the Danish cartoons phenomenon, except that they didn't put the cartoons in the book. Yeah. This is an academic press. It's Yale. They couldn't, they wouldn't. They were afraid to do it. And I suspect they would say that's because of what Ayaan just said. That when you up for Rogue, they're saying, look, we don't want a bomb to go off here. We don't want, and it's worth it for us to print the book about this incident without including the very thing that caused the controversy. So, Brett, you've been following this. Do you have any of you written about this? You've just heard Ayaan. You just saw the film probably for the first time, second time. So what's your take on this? And especially I'm interested in about the Ayaan's argument about what liberals, Western liberals, the capitulation of Western liberals in a society that simply has withdrawn its liberal values when it comes to this issue.
Well, first of all, let me say how thrilled I am to be sharing the stage with you, a friend of many years, and one of the few liberals I know who actually believes in liberalism and practices it on a daily basis.
Thank you.
And also, I think all of us are here tonight, at least I'm here tonight, because of the sense that Ayaan is just one of the most magnificent women in the world today. And if you, I was thinking about this.
Thank you.
I was thinking about this with of course, the Brandeis disinvitation, which is a badge of honor. I was thinking that if you're a man who doesn't admire Ayaan's courage, you have no balls. And if you're a woman who doesn't admire her intellect, you have no brain.
Oh, that's not
and there's a dearth of both at Brandeis. Now, many years ago, right around the time I first discovered the 92nd Street Y, I discovered the novels of Thomas Mann. And there's a wonderful line in his book, The Magic Mountain, which really anticipates not just the First World War, but the great political divide between liberalism and totalitarianism in the 20th century. And he has a character who's a kind of this proto-totalitarian figure, a lapsed Jesuit priest by the name of Nafta. And Nafta spends his days in these long debates with this sort of soft, Kofi Annan-esque type liberal by the name of Settembrini. And somewhere buried in the novel, Nafta makes an observation. He says, "It is a cruel misunderstanding of youth to believe that at the heart of man's desire is the desire to be free. At the heart of man's desire is the desire to obey." It's a very profound line because it reminds us that when we liberals think about how all people wish to be free, that's not quite true. That's something that has to be struggled for. Totalitarian ideologies, Nazism, communism, fascism, dominated much of the 20th century, not only because they were militarily more skillful, wilier, politically savvier, but because there was some segment of the population that wanted to submit to totalitarian rule. And there is, I think, a continuation of that 20th century drama, communism versus the West, in the West's confrontation with much of the Islamic world today. You know, this film is called Submission. The definition, the word Islam means submission. I think the great question, if I were to boil it down, the great question of our age is liberalism a religion of submission? That is to say, does liberalism have the internal resources to defend the things for which it purportedly stands? I think that's a tough question. I'll tell you an anecdote. A few years ago, there was this, what I thought was this unbelievably anti-Semitic short play by a British playwright named Carol Churchill.
We went together.
Right. So you remember this, exactly.
I must have left such an impression on him that night.
Yeah.
I swear to God, I was sitting right next to him. There was no one else.
I was telling it for the benefit of the
All right.
audience.
Oh, yeah. Nice recovery.
Doesn't quite appreciate our intimacy, the nepotism which has brought me to this stage. But at any rate, so it's this really short 10-minute play that essentially purports to say that the Jews in the 40s were the victims of Nazi atrocities, and now, in effect, the Jews are the new Nazis. That's the essence, the heart of the play. And in the process, it plays on these really nasty, classic anti-Semitic tropes. So who better to moderate the discussion about the play from the stage of a theater on the Lower East Side than Tony Kushner, Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and the maker of Angels in America, outspoken as a socialist, outspoken as a gay man, outspoken as an artist. So in the course of the play, there was an opportunity to have a conversation with the audience, and I raised my hand. Kushner called on me, and I said, you know, Tony, very courageous of you to bring this play to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I know that really took some courage there, but I just want to know when do you intend to stage Angels in America at the Islamic University of Gaza? And what was amazing is in this audience of essentially progressives who were busy clapping at this anti-Semitic play, I was hissed. You remember that?
I do.
And then Kushner came up to me later and said, well, what do you mean? And I said, you know, Tony, when they come for us, right, they're going to go for you first. Because I'm the right-wing dinosaur, but you're gay and you're left-wing and you're an artist.
And you're Jewish.
And you're Jewish, by the way. We're both Jewish.
Sadly Jewish.
So bear that in mind. We need, I think the great question of the day, I'll wrap it up with this, is can the left in the West, because this is not a problem for the right. Right has other problems. many other problems. But can the left recover something of the spine of a Franklin Roosevelt or a Harry Truman, who knew that those values we cherish, free speech, provocation, freedom of religion, absence of religion, freedom to insult, freedom to be crude and gross and use the word fuck on a stage, okay, that those rights need a stalwart defense, that the answer isn't simply to submit to the totalitarians, whether it's Lenin, Stalin, bin Laden, or Omar al-Baghdadi. I think that's the question that we are confronted with now.
All right, Ayaan. People have said, your critics have said, let's just take a look at a kind of rundown of things that you've said about Islam. You've said Islam is a cult of death. You said it was a nihilistic death cult. You said violence is inherent in Islam. Islam is new fascism, that we need to declare war on Islam, and you might have even at one point said, I wrote that something, that it's evil incarnate. I'm not sure if you've actually used that phrase, but I wrote that down.
I don't think since I became an atheist, I used the word evil.
Yeah, evil. So one question is, those who are your critics say, look, this is very inflammatory language. Aren't you exposing yourself as an Islamophobe? That this is the language of hate speech, and that if you want to be invited to Brandeis, talk to people without pissing them off, you know, and that just give it to them, and there's got to be another way to deliver the message, right?
Yeah.
Well, how do you respond to the Islamophobe hate speech bigotry argument?
Well, first of all, along these quotes that have been taken out of several interviews, I've constantly made a distinction between Islam as a set of ideas and Muslims as people. I've always and consistently do acknowledge the great diversity among the believers, those who are like ISIS, very literal in their reading of the belief system, all the way to those who just identify themselves as Muslim but really don't take it seriously. So I've always acknowledged that diversity. Now, when it comes to the doctrine, unreformed, if you're not afraid of it, you're foolish. If you're not afraid of a belief system that urges day in, day out, that believers go out and kill and maim and sell women into sex slavery and engage in, if you're not afraid of that, then I don't know on which planet you live. It is rational. It's not phobic, it's rational to be afraid of verses in the Quran and that belief system that urges believers to go off and behead. If you live in Oklahoma now, you've become conscious of that belief system. And to look amongst the people who are really observant of that, who might just take off, is rational. And we see it, and we've seen it in the last 13 years. Our governments in the West, the United States and beyond, have spent tons of money and resources and time trying to deal with that rational fear in a rational way. What we fail to do, and this is my answer to my critics, and again to go back to the bigot / apology debate, is to say, in order to have a coherent policy, it doesn't even have to be smart, as long as it's coherent. We haven't, since 9/11/2001, you look at the policies regarding this matter of all governments, and the first thing that strikes you is how incoherent it is. And why? Because the premise from the beginning is that Islamic extremism is not rooted in Islam. If you think that proposition is true, And a lot of people think that, at least our administration does that. I think all officially, even the administration before that, and most of Western administrations take that as their starting point. Then you're going to have incoherent policies. If you accept that it may be rooted in Islam, you give yourself, as policymakers and as society, a more strategic and a more tactical and a wider way of saying, okay, on the one hand, we're going to encourage and we're going to talk to people who have adopted our liberal values from within that huge group of Muslims. Sometimes it's sensible to employ military, sometimes it's sensible to employ, economic, judicial, all of these tools. But the way you start with this premise, Islamic extremism is not rooted in Islam, then you just have, what my critics are saying, which is you'll have an incoherent, and I know tonight we're not supposed to talk about policy, it's all about art. But the short answer to your question is, it is rational today to fear the doctrine of Islam. Muslims, that's a different story. They are the believers, and there's a huge, some of them you need to fear, some of them you don't need to fear. The wider majority, you need to persuade them to take sides.
Now, this raises an interesting question about the swiftness with which the words racism and bigotry get invoked in this conversation. Yeah. And Brett, you touched on this a moment ago, so please, I hope you'll join in on this. Because it does raise the question of whether criticism of a religion, right, whether the criticism of the religion itself, whether that is racism and bigotry. In other words, the idea that ideas and doctrine should be fair game is one argument, that we should be able to challenge or criticize the ideas and the doctrine. We're not speaking to the people, just to the ideas, just in the same way that if you were a communist and you were taking a class in capitalism on a university campus and people pointed out about all the failures, horrible failures of communism, would that be hate speech to communists? To say that I feel really threatened now because I really believe in communism and I just don't like the way I'm feeling now. And I don't mean this to be glib or funny, I'm just saying in a way, in the film festival, the Foreign Film Festival is about ideas, right? This is not, the question is faith when it comes to Islam receiving special treatment in that way? Because we're treating it in a way that we might not. And so in other words, it's one thing, as you said, you separate the people from the ideas and the doctrine. And so to the extent to which that's what's being criticized, and not the religion, and not the people, but the ideas themselves and the following of those ideas. The reason I'm saying this, you may have heard recently, and the well-known philosopher / new atheist Sam Harris, who is a good friend of yours, by the way.
He's a very good friend.
He invoked your name on Bill Maher last week. You all saw that, right? I have to tell you, Ben Affleck is very upset by this. And I'm upset when Ben Affleck is upset. No, I am, because what Ben thinks matters to me. And usually, and I'm sure you feel the same, it matters what he thinks, and stop laughing. Sam Harris, what got Ben nuts was this language. And he said, Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas. Now, the next day, Anderson Cooper had Sam Harris on his program. And he said to him, he says, you just said that Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas. Surely you're going to take that back. You're going to reconsider that. And he said, no, it's the mother lode of bad ideas. Now, again, is it possible?
Ideas.
It's about ideas. That's what I'm saying. He introduced this idea. The guy's got a PhD in philosophy. He's saying, as an ideas-based book, this book's ideas don't make sense to me, and I want to point out why. And in fact, he used you as an example of one of the reasons why There's a problem is that you can't walk around like regular people walk around, that if it's the book that's causing that, that's not a good idea, right? And so, I don't know, Brad, both of you probably have lots to say about this idea that the distinctions that are being made, because I can tell you, you know, I'm on a university campus. This is very hard to do. You can't actually have this conversation. This night wasn't that easy to produce. You know, so there's a reason for it, and the reason for it is because this appears to be bordering on hate speech. It's violating those codes to have these conversations on any level.
Well, look, I have a slightly different view than Ayan on this. I mean,
but do you agree with Ben? No.
Well, I agree with what you're saying about Ben in this sense. Reflex idiot think is important. That is to say, if your average Hollywood idiot reflexively stands for free speech, as he should as an artist, quote unquote, in various ways.
He's Batman.
Right? If your reflex view is to say, hey, this is a free country, free speech, let 1,000 flowers bloom, that's important. The scary thing about Ben Affleck wasn't that here's an intelligent guy with an opposing point of view. The scary thing is he's a stand-in for lots of people who just kind of jerk their knee, and this is what they come up with. I differ with Ayan in a certain sense. I'm basically of the view that many religions essentially amount to a lot of gobbledygook. And
I share that.
and you can read them however you want, okay? And you know, you can extract whatever, you can choose to say that certain meanings are, certain stories are allegorical, other stories are true, certain verses matter, other stories do not. I mean, sometime in the last 500 years, it became important in Christianity, Jesus' line, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God, because that became a basis for accepting a political dispensation in which there was a separation between the church and the state. 1,500 years before that, you had a very different view of what the prerogatives of the church were over the state, and this is the story of Western civilization. So I'm perfectly happy if a Muslim theologian comes to me and says, look, you know nothing about Islam, it is a religion of peace, et cetera, fine. I'm not going to have that argument. My problem is not the substance of Islam. My problem is the behavior today of way too many Muslims in the face of provocation, intellectual provocation. I mean, those big guys at the corner here, and I'm glad they're big, they're not guarding against some Islam that might rush the stage, right? The people who are going to rush the stage are people who call, or are likely to be, well, unlikely, but if anyone would rush the stage in the unlikely event, I have to be clear, right, very unlikely event, to hurt mainly this woman, they would be Muslims. Now, what has gone into their brain that they should take such oversaturated offense at the expression of these views, at this 9-minute and 55-second movie? What has happened in the Islamic world that so many, especially boys, have been raised to be to give vent to impulses that elsewhere would be described as psychotic? That's a question, and in a way, I think it's a more productive way of thinking, right? Than saying, well, Islam says this, no, Islam says that. I'm more than happy to accept the most charitable interpretation of Surah and the Quran and so on. Okay? What I'd like to know is, where are the Muslims' mothers and fathers who are saying to their children, and by the way, there are millions that are saying, you, my daughter, are worth every bit as much as you, my son. My ambitions for my girls are just as great as my ambitions for my boys. And why is it that as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, gee, this must be a controversial thing to say? Because if I were saying it about Mormons, shall we say, or Jehovah's Witnesses, I wouldn't think twice about it. But to say it in connection with Muslim communities becomes really, really difficult. And you can say, oh, this represents this tiny minority, and I'm perfectly prepared to accept vast majority of Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. The kind of these expressions. But there are not millions, not tens of millions, but potentially hundreds of millions of Muslims who are giving birth to Mohammed Bouyeris, the man who stuck a knife in Theo van Gogh. And that's a problem that you have to address. What kind of people are you raising? What kind of societies are you putting together? And how can you, and I guess the final point I would make is, I was watching this movie and I thought, the power of this movie is there are 750 million Muslim women, give or take, right? This is one of the first works of art that has ever bothered to investigate the interior life of almost a tenth of the world's population. That's quite something.
You reminded me of the Benghazi crisis, because I thought about how quickly the world accepted that it was a movie that caused the raid on the embassy and the killing of, of course, if it's a movie, of course, then everyone should be killed,
Yeah.
And I mean, again, it is.
No, it's understandable.
Right, we can understand, and it was this sort of. It was so twisted that we capitulated to the idea that, of course, now I understand someone in LA made a movie. Now, it turns out he didn't make a movie, but if he did, that would have explained everything, instead of saying, this is horrifying. This is an embassy. It's inviolate all over the world. This is how we all roll. You don't go into embassies and start killing the ambassador, even if you don't like the movie.
But please, I know we need to get going. We need to get rolling.
Rolling is the key word.
Rolling is the word here. But to come to Brett's point about, Brett, I completely agree with you. I do not, if you define Islam, say, as the Quran or the Hadith or, stacks and stacks of documents that are morally centered in the 7th and 8th centuries, I don't think that it's the stacks of documents that will come on this stage and harm me. But I think it's incredibly important to see this link, and that is why this problem today is a uniquely Islamic problem / Muslim problem. You have Muslims, and they're very, very diverse. You have the Islamic doctrine. And in between, the link is you have all these institutions. You have the institution of education. And those leaders in charge of the institution of education are taking out of that doctrine the things that we are all condemning. There are so-called Islamic centers or cultural centers. That's another institution of socialization. The institution of, politics, identity. If you look at, we had dinner tonight with Tom. And Tom is a
the guy who pronounces Van Gogh properly.
Yeah, Van Gogh.
Sort of properly.
Sort of properly. So
better than me.
Here is a contemporary philanthropist, and he chooses to give his money to cultural institutions like this one. He chooses to collect art. There are other philanthropists, Jewish, Catholic, etc., who want to give to areas for life. Now, I want you to take a good look, at where wealthy, extremely wealthy Muslims, how they spend their money. And why is it that there is so much philanthropic activity going to individuals who pick and choose from that historic doctrinal work in order to persuade as many numbers of Muslims as possible to engage in all of these things that we are condemning? So you are absolutely right. It's not the Quran that will come jumping up at me or harm me or you or anyone else, but Islam defined not only as submission, total obedience, not only what is the heritage, the legacy of its unreformed doctrine, but today, the countries that lead the Sunni population, 85% of Muslims, Saudi Arabia, has stepped up its beheadings and amputations, what they call the Hudud law. We have Iran, which represents or thinks that they represent the Shia minority. We have Pakistan having blasphemy laws. We have Sudan having Sharia. We have an international Islamic movement that aspires toward a world where Sharia law is imposed on everyone. That is Islam unreformed. And Islam can be reformed, but it is, whether we like it or not, it is Islam. And to go to the Ben Affleck discussion, Ben Affleck, talented actor, screenwriter, all of that. Now, and not only him, probably the whole of Hollywood. And this says something about Western culture today. We've made films about remarkable men in human history. You'll find movies about Hammurabi. How many of you know who that is? I've watched amazing footage, and it's the movie, it's the brilliance of just the visuals of Ben-Hur. You've seen movies of Moses. You've seen many movies of Jesus. If Ben Affleck were to act as Muhammad, the most relevant historic figure of our day, or any other actor, remarkable, who is going to act that? The fact that there are no movies in our day about Muhammad, that tells you where Hollywood is. It tells you where Western culture is right now. The Iraqis, when they were invaded by ISIS, the Iraqi soldiers who put their weapons down and ran away, we condemn them as cowards. Hollywood doesn't have to put its weapons. They're not faced with the same threat, but they're acting from a cultural perspective, they're acting in exactly the same way.
Wouldn't it be nice, though, if Ben did take the Muhammad role?
He's very good at the superhero role, and you know that Muhammad is and was a superhero.
And there'd be no sequel to that.
Or maybe there would be.
No.
That tells you all.
Ayaan, so many people say, your critics, they say, look, forget the vituperative language. You're over-inclusive, you're over-broad, you over-generalize. And they say, isn't your critique really one of region, geography, custom, and culture if you focus, for say, on genital cutting, on mutilation? Because one of the arguments is, well, you're African, so it's an African problem. Stop blaming Arabs. This is something that's Central African, it's East African, it's what you experience, a horrible childhood, but don't pin this on all of the Arab Persian Gulf societies. It doesn't exist in Pakistan. I mean, yes, there's a lot of beheadings in Saudi Arabia, but apparently there's not that much genital cutting. So, well, I don't mean to be funny. I'm just saying it is what it is. There's this guy, I want him with me all the time. Take this guy on the road with me. So it is an interesting question to say, this is a bait and switch. You're focusing on genital cutting, and really, this isn't dealing with those societies. This is an African problem. It's the region, not the religion.
So here's the thing. I grew up a Muslim woman, devout Muslim household within Muslim communities. Female genital mutilation is just one. It's a big problem, but it's one of the problems that faces us as Muslim women who are growing up within Islam. As the film Submission shows, there are other problems, more current, much larger, and sometimes more consequential. If you're 9 years old and you're married off to a man 3, 4, 5 times your age, and you never get to finish school, and you have 10 children, that is far more consequential than going through this incredibly cruel cutting. But then if you finish school and you get on with your life, you have, a better likelihood, at least, of a good life than if any of these other things that I've just shown you is addressed. And what you are, the question you're asking is, when we're talking about the position, the general position of the Muslim woman, what does Islamic doctrine say about women? What do Muslim clerics who are preaching today in our mosques, what do they say about women? How do they enforce parts of this doctrine that we don't like? My critics then will seize on the FGM issue and say, oh, but that's something that happens in Somalia. And they'll edit out the fact that it also happens to 98% of Egyptians and Sudanese and Eritreans and in fact, and Yemenis and all kinds of, there are also closed societies where this, the fact that
and Malaysia and Indonesia?
Malaysia and Indonesia. In Malaysia and Indonesia, it's a recent phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that was exported with the Muslim Brotherhood's missionary works.
I read that, right.
And so, people who want to silence me, whether it is by exhausting me through this kind of idiotic conversation or public shaming or public shaming or threats of death, it really doesn't matter. Ultimately, all of us have to deal with what we are seeing now, and it's an enormous problem. Can't get out of it this way.
Brett, a number of years ago, you wrote a column, I remember, about...
I might not remember it.
Yeah,
Go
you
ahead.
might, but I'll help you with this. Since you didn't remember, I sat with you. About this language that we've been told that we should always try to support moderate Islam, that we should do everything to support the moderate in the Islamic world. And you were, I think, the first person that I read who said, well, wait a minute, maybe we should be focusing not on moderate Muslims, and you actually talked about a number of clerics who are reformist Muslims, that this is really the focus and not on moderate Muslims. And maybe you can talk a little about that column, because the question is, is it possible, why is it that we can't have this conversation, or can Muslims have the conversation about reformation? Catholics in the mid-1960s with Vatican II did it. Jews, Reformed Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, I think they're Jews. I don't know. But they do it, right? Jews have had, every religion seems to have found a way to create a layering of observance and practice. And I wonder, can you revisit that column if you can remember? Because there is a distinction between the moderate and the reformer.
Yeah, this is an important point. Moderate simply is whatever is in the middle of a given spectrum. There is always a moderate in any given society. There are moderate members of the Ku Klux Klan. There are, because there are more extreme ones and there are probably less extreme ones. There were moderate Nazis. Albert Speer was a moderate Nazi, but he was still a Nazi, right? You could say, well, I didn't quite love his taste, et cetera, and so he's a moderate. And there's this fetish in the West, there's this fetish among policymakers to say, oh, we have to look for the moderates. No, we don't have to look for the moderates. We have to look for the liberals. And in fact, when we make a fetish of the moderate Muslims, we are sidelining those often utterly courageous reform Muslims, if you will, who are standing in the wings and are being told, well, you're a little too extreme, or you don't have credibility or whatever to speak to the issues of Islam. And
or you might be an Islamophobe.
Well, exactly. So this is a real problem. We who have, in the West, the money, the credibility, the ability to help, aren't helping the people who need it most. And by the way, this was a point that was brought home to me by a man by the name of Abdul Rahman Wahid, who is better known to Indonesians as Gus Dur. He's one of the greatest men I've probably ever met, who was head of the Nahdlatul Ulama, the largest social movement in the Muslim world, 40-odd million members of the NU in Indonesia. And he was a guy who, as a young man, had gone to Al-Azhar, then to Baghdad, And no one questioned his scholarly credentials as a theologian, and he rejected all this. And I'll never forget coming into his office. By then he was quite old. He died a few years ago. And the first thing he said to me is, "I love Israel." And I thought, huh? That's not what I expected to hear. Then we had a long conversation about Jefferson and Hamilton and the divide between the two. And then he said, really, much of the problem that we have is with Auguste Comte and positivism. And so we ended up having this conversation, right? But you don't really hear about this because we're so besotted by the so-called moderate Muslims, whether they're the moderates of Hamas or the moderates of the Brotherhood or moderates in Iran, like this current so-called moderate president of the country. So this circumscribes our idea of what is possible, who we should be supporting, who we should be speaking, who we should be legitimizing. And we are doing, you talked about policy and the problem with policy. Notice that when the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge of Egypt, fortunately for short duration, the administration was sort of in overdrive to kind of distinguish between the so-called moderate members of the Brotherhood and then the more extreme ones. This is extremely foolish because you're legitimizing what is essentially a radical totalitarian enterprise. What you want to be doing is going to the unheard voices and saying, you know what, you want a better future for yourself and your children, and particularly, by the way, your daughters. And if your brother happens to be gay, you're not going to kill him. You're the people we're going to support because we're liberals, and the standards we hold for ourselves in the West ought to be identical to the standards we apply to everyone. Everything else, last word, you mentioned bigotry. The real bigotry in the West today is the bigotry towards Muslims that assumes that the status quo is pretty much what it's going to be, that you have 1.5 billion Muslims who have no interest in better lives, not submitting to this, not submitting to these strictures, who are just sort of contented with their lot. And what's important to do is not to offend them, not to shake them, not to make them think. You would never say that to your own children. You would never say that on a university campus, but you're willing to relegate 1.5 billion Muslims to that category. So I would argue that today's multiculturalism and quote-unquote liberalism, which is really the opposite of liberalism, is where the real bigotry and racism lies today, to treat Muslims as if they're incapable of moral agency and serious thought.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So those people who say, and many do, that there should be a moral equivalence when it comes to all religions. If you read the book of Leviticus, woof!
Yeah.
Woof, you don't want to mess with that God. And if you, on the other hand, I don't know if you could write the language of the book of Leviticus on a Jewish girl, who would love the part, by the way. And what would happen, right? What would be the outcome of that? But that every religion has its soundbite that makes it sound barbaric and dumb. And that why is it that we only focus on Islam, that you cherry-picked, you and Theo, you pick what you like, you put it up on a screen, and you convince people that that's the whole book.
No, our point was not to convince people that this is the whole book. Our point, my point in particular, was to say, look, these are the verses that in practice are consequential. If we have women's shelters full of Muslim women who are beaten by their husbands, and when we deploy our educational and other measures of convincing the perpetrators not to do it anymore, we are greeted with, oh, but you guys, your culture is different. In my culture, my Quran tells me so. Then I cherry pick it because there is a direct link between what this verse says and how this man is using it to inspire him, and beyond that, how her entire family supports the perpetrator. We would see some of these women who were beaten and just exposed to horrendous violence. And the victims' parents, cousins, and extended family would all first and foremost ask, What did she wrong? What did she do wrong for the perpetrator? She provoked the perpetrator. So it's not just cherry picking. We need to cherry pick to see which parts of the Quran are still alive. You talked about Leviticus. In holy books, you will find passages that do not meet with 21st century morality. But if you look at the history of each of these religions, you see that there was an evolution of provocation after provocation. And the people who wanted the status quo made the same excuses, gave the same reasons that present-day Muslims are giving, that they were offended, that it was blasphemy, blasphemy, blasphemy. So you understand, if it was through a process of blasphemy that Christians and Jews have evolved to become the liberals that they have become majority-wise in the West, that Islam has to go through a process of relentless blasphemy to get to the same place. And that's what art does. That's what culture does. That's what books do. In my next book, I'm very optimistic. I am campaigning for a Muslim reformation, and I believe it's underway. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you, the way to get there is not going to be through the clerics. Hanging around waiting for Muslim clerics to adapt doctrine, it's not going to happen. It's going to come through a relentless process of blasphemy. Every single Muslim who looks at you and says, I'm offended, my feelings are hurt, you have to say, what hurts your feelings more? The sacred text or human life? This woman who's beaten or the sacred text? This woman who's raped or the sacred text? Human life, human freedom, human dignity matters more than any sacred text. Christians have been through it, Jews have been through it. It's now time that Muslims go through it, and we better stop kidding ourselves. If you want to help, you're going to blaspheme.
I listened to your last two responses, and it reminded me that I should read this. This is the 2013 Pew Research Center poll. It was taken from the years 2008 to 2012 in 39 countries, Muslim faith-based countries, but moderate Muslim nations. For instance, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are not even in this. It's scary. Among other things, Muslims, a majority, varying somewhat according to a region, majorities favor putting to death apostates and adulterers, condemn homosexuality, abortion, and euthanasia as flat out immoral, and believe, quote, that a wife must obey her husband, close quote. This is, huge majorities, huge, like scary. Large minorities condone honor killings. So at least that's in the large, it's a large minority, but still under 50%. And it's important to remember that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are not in this poll, and that number would have been higher. When we talk about how much blasphemy is required, that's a lot.
Can I just interject here for a second? Because most of our conversations about, especially conversations at the 92nd Street Y, about changing the Muslim world are very interesting, and in some ways they're moot. The truth is, what we can change is liberalism as it's defined today. The liberalism is about us, even me, believe it or not. And that's to say, and I was watching Submission, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful? Every university has some core curriculum. For instance, when you arrive as a freshman in college, there are things you must do, right? Sensitivity training, getting drunk, whatever. Everyone in every college should just watch this film. They don't have to like it. They don't have to have an opinion of it. They can hate it. They got to watch it. It's part of an education. What you talked about, a process of relentless blasphemy, is what a liberal education is supposed to be. Western philosophy starts with Socrates having a fight with a city. The city wins that round, but in the long run, Socrates wins. Socrates is not blaspheming the gods by committing philosophy. This is the whole story of Western civilization from Socrates to Spinoza, and somehow, bizarrely, it ends sometime around 1966, 1967, when liberalism decided that, frankly, it would rather be post-liberalism and even vaguely totalitarian. And there's an effort that needs to be made to reclaim what liberalism is. Now the difficulty is that it's not simply a philosophical effort, it's a moral effort, because people need injections of spine at various universities, administrators do, that doesn't usually go with the academic profile, having guts, standing up for a community of free speech, accepting that tolerance is about a variety of points of view. And that, I don't see that effort really being made. There have to be people in this audience who belong to academic communities. Teach outrageous texts, and by the way, don't just make fun of Mormons. It's easy to make fun of Mormons. I went to a play, a musical on Broadway, paid $200 to go see Mormons being made fun of. Ha ha, right? The Mormon church, okay, is not planning to bomb theaters in Broadway because they're upset. The Mormons go, stupid Broadway play. They go on, they're very successful, right? Because they belong to a world in which they understand how to deal with offense, and they understand, by the way, that what is holy to them can't be soiled by what some idiot playwright might say. That's what it means to be a mature member of a liberal society. The ability to give offense when you need to, and the ability to accept offense when it's given. That's part of liberalism. And we're not teaching, I don't think we're teaching that. People get offended over nothing. Over nothing. And that's what we have to change.
Ayaan, I'm going to take some audience questions, but first let me just ask one other thought. You know, with respect to university communities, they're all throughout the United States and certainly around the West, there are young women who attend Western universities. Some wear a burqa. They feel about themselves as if they are Muslims and practicing Muslims. I mean, they're involved in the Western world, right? They're among the West. Are you in some ways denying their right as Muslims to interpret their religion under their own terms? That it's depriving them of their own agency to say, look, I'm living in the West, I'm reading the books that Brett told me to read, I'm doing everything they told me to do, but I'm dressed this way and I pray this way, and I want you to let me just be the kind of Muslim woman that I want to be, and stop giving us images of women that are unrecognizable to me. And it's true, I'm sure a lot of women who go to universities in the United States, this is unrecognizable to them. And they're saying, look, I wear what I wear and I pray how I pray, and that's not me.
I have no say. I don't even think about whether Muslim students going to campuses where, or what they wear, what they believe in. The women I address are the women who come to our foundation. The women who are saying, my school is being cut off, I'm being beaten. The women, you know, we have to deploy we have to put so much energy to get girls who are kidnapped out of here by their own parents and taken to Pakistan and taken to parts of the Middle East and bring them back. I have to go and beg with the State Department to say, please, help this desperate woman. So we are sort of a chant. These are the faces we see, the women's stories we listen to. If I were to say anything to, you know, the privileged Muslim women in these campuses and in positions of leadership who find themselves within families that are loving and generous and that give them an opportunity to go to school, I would only ask them to be solidar with the women that we deal with and help them out. When I've never brought, 10 years ago, 13 years ago, when I came into Dutch Parliament and I was asked to speak about these things, I didn't bring Islam into it. I didn't bring the Prophet Muhammad. I didn't quote the Quran. It's always the perpetrator and the wider family of the perpetrator who are saying, this is my religion. I'm doing it because of this verse or because I'm following in Muhammad's example. And the women we see today are all giving the same reason. So we've got to talk about it. I don't want to talk about, in my view, a privileged Muslim woman. If that's what she wants, she puts on whatever she wants. Who cares about that? But when I address these issues, if Muslim student associations, women and men, try and disrupt the events so that I can't voice the problems of the constituency that I'm speaking for, this constituency that's voiceless, then I have to confront them, and I have to confront them with their own actions and confront them with the fact that in this moral divide, they are taking the wrong position.
Okay. All right, let's take a few audience questions. We'll say goodnight to our guests, and we'll reconvene hopefully Saturday night for the post-screening discussion for Zero Dark 30 with Michael Mukasey and Raymond Kelly. This is from our friend Steve out there. Steve, this is for you. In your book, Infidel, Ayaan, you reference your grandmother repeatedly. What would your grandmother say about your role today?
Ooh, that's a difficult one. Probably not so difficult. I think my grandmother would say, I need some money. She would say, infidel or not, whatever's going on with you, I'm in my old age and I need to be more comfortable, and you need to give me as much money as I need. Actually, very pragmatic.
Here's a question. I don't know, Brett, you might be able to answer this. I don't even know if this is a rhetorical question. I don't even know if it's true. It says, why are young women so attracted to ISIS?
Yeah.
Is there truth to this?
Yes.
Well, why is that the case? What is it about ISIS that makes women hot?
Well,
Power.
look, I don't think it's just young women, but the question is in reference to these 2 or 3 young women who were from Colorado, stopped, I guess, in Turkey on their way to join ISIS. But it gets to what I said at the very beginning. We delude ourselves psychologically by imagining that freedom is the deepest impulse of the human soul. Freedom contends with submission. Freedom contends, or choice contends with no choice. And I think there has always been that impulse out there to belong to a movement that asks everything of you, that gives you no options, where there's only one thing on the menu every single day forever. Because the truth about free society is that it contains its own terror, the terror of having to choose. And all of you in this room probably know people who are afraid of choice, who are afraid of opportunity, who are afraid of societies where you have to pick your own destiny. People often want their destiny picked for them and are quite grateful when you do. I don't know if this is true in the case of these 16-year-olds, or they were just besotted by Noam Chomsky and was off to the races. But this is, I think this is a point that isn't, the 20th century, by the way, gave us this wonderful literature of totalitarianism. Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, pays rereading. Czesław Miłosz's The Captive Mind. Great works of political psychology. The True Believer, Eric Hoffer, is another great book that analyze these phenomena. These are jewels really written for the communist era, but jewels to help us understand the phenomena of young girls from the West, presumably with all kinds of opportunity, wanting to throw themselves into submission, the desert, maybe martyrdom.
Here's one question I had, and there's someone else from the audience. I had read somewhere, this person is asking, is there a part 2, a sequel? There was some thought that you and Theo were going to make one, the same idea, this would have pleased Tony Kushner immensely, about homosexuals under the Quran. Was that something that was in the works and obviously never got close because Theo didn't live? I know that you also now, you executive produced a film called Honor Diaries.
Yeah.
And is that in some ways a part 2 to Submission?
No, Honor Diaries is not a part 2 to Submission. Part 2 of Submission would have done exactly what part 1 has done. Take out those verses that live today. If you look at some holy books, including the Quran, parts of it are dead. People don't practice it, don't want to practice it. But if you take these, some of these verses, they live to today. And so we were going to take that out regarding gays and have submission about gays. And I haven't had time to explain the whole film, but the whole point is each individual who has a Quranic text written on her says on the prayer mat, Muslims pray 5 times a day, they face Mecca, and so you have the individual with the eyes lowered, and that is the sign of submission. And there's the complaint, Allah, I've submitted, I've done everything you told me to do, and I live in this misery. I don't know if I'm going to submit any longer. And so part 2 would be same thing, take out what's relevant and then about homosexuals. And we would do the same for Jewish people, what the Quran says about Jews. That part of the Quran is alive. What happened to the 2 Jewish tribes in Medina in the 7th century is what some of these radicals want to do today using modern means. So that is relevant, and on and on. So we wanted to...
You're saying there would have been a part 3 that would have been about Jews.
There'd be a part 3 and a part 4 and a part 5 until you exhaust, you have a comprehensive debate. It didn't happen, and I don't know if it's going to happen. I would like for it to happen, but it's a very dangerous enterprise.
What were you taught about Jews when you were growing up in Somalia, Ayaan? What were they teaching you about Jews?
Okay, just that's somehow got to be the last question.
I grew up in Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and within my Muslim communities, the most, I would say, anti-Jewish community was in Saudi Arabia. But I have this, in my memory, when I was about 15 or 16 years old, that, I kind of lived in this Islam where you pray and people mind their own business, and sometimes, you nudge one another, oh, come on, pray, things like that. Nothing, not too observant. There was this general attitude that Jews are bad and that they're the cause of all bad things. I remember we lived in Saudi Arabia, and this is in the 1970s, and when my mother opened the tap in the kitchen sink, and the tap started to cough, and, after a bit of coughing, there was no water. And she said, oh, those Jews are at it again. There was that kind of thing. And then in the late 1980s in Kenya, among my fellow Muslim communities, it was, if I failed exams, it was the Jews who were doing it. If it didn't rain, the Jews were behind it. I mean, you could think of any evil thing. HIV started to just about come up or come on. It was all caused by the Jews. So there was that was pretty much, and it started to pick up in my lifetime from after around 1985. And it came very strongly with this movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. But there were others. There was also a Shia movement active in Kenya. who are, they would show us glossy magazines of rows and rows and rows of dead people, and then pictures of the Israeli flag and how that was being caused. Yeah.
Brett, last words. Hundreds of millions of Muslims believe in a strict adherence to Sharia law. When you have democratic elections throughout what appears to have been Arab Spring, Muslim Brotherhood wins many of them, and Hamas wins in Gaza. Iran is ascendant. You cover the global view. It doesn't seem like a sanguine picture.
Yes, the subtitle to my book is The Coming Global Disorder. It should be now The Current Global Disorder, but I started writing this a couple years ago. To your point, so that one of the errors in retrospect of the side of the neoconservative approach to the Middle East was the fetish of democracy. We had to have democratic elections in Palestinian Authority, Iraq, Egypt, and so on, with a view that democracy would beget liberalism. That is to say, if you have a democratic process, different sides have to learn to get along. They understand that power will alternate. They want to get their voices heard, so they will have newspapers and so on. And what we learn is that that's just not right. Liberalism begets democracy. Democracy doesn't necessarily beget liberalism. It's liberal cultures or liberalizing cultures, mainly in Europe, that eventually became democratic states, because the liberal software, if you will, was there, and all it needed was the democratic hardware to give expression to those values. And so how do you, the challenge now in the Middle East, stop Iran from getting a bomb, those are the obvious challenges, but the long-term cultural challenge, it seems to me, is how do you go about begetting a culture of liberalism that may someday bear fruit in a democratic order that is decent, progressive, and tolerant? And that's a tough question. I have a friend in Egypt, and he has been translating the Federalist Papers and other core liberal texts, Locke's letter concerning toleration, into Arabic, because he feels that young Arabs, at least intellectual Arabs, need to have access to these words, to these ideas, the DNA of modern liberal democratic society. That's a process for, I think, generations, but we're not even starting it right now. We're not even talking about it. That needs to be done. And imagine I had a philanthropy, I would have a philanthropy, a university of liberalism, in which I would select 100 really promising people from Middle Eastern countries or Muslim communities in the West, and I would give them a great books education in liberalism and what it means to be a thinking person in an open society, what it means to really understand what Karl Popper was talking about with the open society. Start small, but if you imagine doing 100 young people, men and women, a year, 30 years from now, you've got a lot of people, and maybe they are going to be the next leaders of their society. That liberal pedagogy needs to start to create this. People talk about Muslim reform, the need for Muslim reform. Let's make the reformers.
Come on, this was one memorable night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Ayan.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being part of this. Thank you.